let's start with the interview. The relevance of mother languages, both in philosophical interpretation and creation, is one of the topics you cherish the most. You even made it a point of discussion for the upcoming Congress of the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Philosophie. I wanted to know if you think that the importance of the original language could be even stronger in the case of German idealism, which itself dedicated a lot of attention to the relationship between language, logic, and being. And what is your opinion on the progressive Anglicization, philosophical research, and the field of Hegelian studies as well is currently undergoing?
Well, concerning German idealism, and I would include Marx also, Hegel is a special case because in Kantian and even in Fichtean philosophy you have a lot of Latin language in the background. In some sense, Kantian German is a little bit like Latin, but if it comes to Hegel, a lot of German notions are used, and they are used in some of ways and double meanings. For example, Wesen, it is a verb on one hand, mean essence on the other hand. It has a lot of philosophical overtones. And Hegel is very clear in using these things. So if I have to work with English translations of Hegel's text and of Marx's text, who is discussing Hegel, and all these Hegelian overtones or the nuances are lost in translation. That's a special thing. It's the same with the later Schelling, another member of the German idealism group. And I think this is one of the main reasons why the Anglo-American tradition stuck to Kant mainly and avoided going to the other one. Generally, I'm always saying that every culture should be allowed to philosophize in their own language, and they should do that at least as long as they deal with their own tradition. And my own maxim always is, I won't publish and teach philosophy if I'm not able to read the text in the original language. For me, this means I can do it only in German and English language, and I ignore the other traditions because of my own incompetence. But my sense of the ongoing development and the overall philosophy scene in the world is that if I say I'm not able to discuss and read Italian or French or Spanish philosophy or Chinese or something Japan, I think I have made a mistake. And a lot of contemporary English-speaking philosophers think that the original philosophers like Hegel and Fichte made the mistake not to write directly in English. And this is a kind of lost sensitivity. And this is something I sometimes say it's a kind of imperialism we should avoid, because quality is missing. And when I was running and editing an international journal, I refused to accept papers which were dealing with, for example, Kant or Hegel research, and I could see that the author is not able to read German original text. I said, no American journal would accept a paper of mine if I were not able to read and write in English language. And so we should have equal rights here, and this is a problem, actually. Yeah.
The process of Anglicization of Hegelian studies doesn't seem to have concerned exclusively the formal and practical aspects of the mean of communication. What is your opinion on the recent Hegelian Renaissance? May take it as a progressive impoverishment of conceptual content and questions faced to original text. Would you agree? What will be dead and what will be alive of such a renaissance in a close future? Do you think it puts Europe in a position of minority towards classical German idealism studies?
Well, to begin with the last part of this very complex question is, it would be a special situation for Germany. I think if, as I see it, even in Italy, English becomes the first foreign language to be learned. I know it in Hungary, for example, the same. 20 years ago, most of them learned German in school as a first foreign language, and they were interested in this kind of culture background. Now they are shifting for a lot of reasons, and a lot of very good reasons, not having to do with science, but with the overall economic situations and so on. And it might be that in 10 years, someone studying Hegel in Spain or in Italy already isn't able to read it in German anymore. And then it wouldn't be a loss for those if everything is happening in English language. It would be even an improvement because they were fulfilling the standard. But for Germany that would be a bad situation because we have only this advantage that at least in some sense Hegel's German is our German. It is not identical. It's even 200 years old and a very special German. But it would be a special problem for the German tradition. More generally, I always think it's helpful to translate, for example, Hegel's text and Hegel's philosophy into the language and the vocabulary of the contemporary analytical philosophy. Because then you can see that something gets lost or is missing. But the translation process is what is necessary. And in that situation when you are not able to do that because you don't have the other side, you cannot see that something is missing. And then you are making mistakes, crude mistakes, really crude mistakes. And my experience sometimes is that I say to scholars working on, for example, Hegel, quoting the English edition, I say, well, that's nice, that is the English edition's Hegel, that's not the real Hegel. Look in the German text, there is something different. And they say, that doesn't matter. And then I say, well, don't do Hegel anymore, because if it doesn't matter what is in the texts, yes, you are doing something else. But there's one problem concerning Hegel. A lot of people read these lectures, the editions of the lectures, and they are not Hegel, original Hegel too. So in some sense it's a complicated situation. But yes, I think it's helpful if you can read it in both languages and compare it. I don't have experience in Italian translation, but I think if you see, I read the German paragraph in the encyclopedia and then I read the Italian one, and I can see, well, there's something going lost. I pay attention to it and I start thinking about why, so I can make philosophical progress. So that's it. Bilingual would be helpful.
So again, a question on the Hegelian Renaissance, one more. One of the major critiques against this Renaissance is the one of building the up-to-date character of their interpretation of Hegel on the sacrifice of the systematic integrity, so the sacrifice of the whole system. In general, they're accused of applying a poor philological method, not accurate to the text. This also, I think, comes from the common myth of painting a sharp distinction between historical disciplines and creative or conceptual disciplines in philosophy. What do you think is the correct balance between historical awareness and theoretical creativity in philosophy?
That's a very complicated question again, because now I have to say something about my metaphilosophical stance. And as you know, in philosophy, one of the most contested questions is what philosophy really is. And I think that there are a lot of philosophical questions and problems which we cannot understand correctly or deeply without knowing their history. And this is one of the big insights in Hegel. On the other hand, in analytical philosophy, there is this tradition, simply start afresh. You get a problem, you think about it. And sometimes this can be very helpful. It's like in art. If you're always trying to write poems having all the history in mind, the chance to be creative is minimal. And if you make a fresh start, there can be expressively very interesting things. But the risk is that you invent something which has been invented 200 times before and you make mistakes a lot of people made in the history. So sometimes I think maybe we can distinguish questions, and maybe in some questions concerning philosophy of science or philosophy of mathematics, it's easier not to go the historical way than if it comes to ethics or aesthetics or something like that. Because in these philosophies dealing with social phenomena, history is part of what we are thinking about. So maybe that's the right answer. I think the problem really is that, and this has been something traditional in Germany too, that people in philosophy thought they should do only history of philosophy because the big figures said what really is true, and we contemporaries only have to spell it out. And if you do that, you lose philosophy. I think if I had to, it would be a hard choice, but if one were pressed to say either do it the analytical way or only philology, I would say I will do it the analytical philosophy, because this is limited philosophy and pure philology is no philosophy at all. So my heart is on that side if it comes to the tough question, but I think it's a wrong alternative. You have to do systematically oriented interpretation or historically informed systematic arguments. This is the right answer, but it's hard to establish. Yeah, that's true.
So, do you think it possible that with the flow of the recent Hegelian Renaissance, a Marx Renaissance would follow, also in the light of the economical crisis undergone in past years and currently still in full swing? What would then be the aspects of Marx philosophy that should be best taken in consideration in that case?
Okay. Well, I can speak for Germany only, because I am not really informed what's going on all over the world concerning Marx. 2 weeks ago I met a colleague from Colombia, and he said that in his country Marx is still a main topic in the political direct campaigns. So it is nearly impossible to establish a philosophical discourse on Marx, because you are always directly related into political things. I think we had this in Italy in the 70s and 60s. We had it all over Europe nearly in this time. So in Germany, I myself decided to start giving lectures on Marx, etc. in 2004. And one of the main reasons for me was that we have these changes in the system in the universities called Bologna process. And we are talking about a very special German interpretation of that. And I told the students that politics economize our universities, and we have to answer this by the critique of political economy, so that students can understand what's going on, at least critical consciousness. That's true, and we started that now 10 years ago, and there is a kind of renaissance. There's a lot of things going on in Germany on what Marx is, and maybe we are now in the position for the first time to read him as a philosopher without directly being identified with the left or the anti-communists, and if you read it that way. So there is some chance now to have a more relaxed stance on that. And 3 years, or maybe 4 years ago, I had to give a lecture in Germany. They invited me, and they had the topic of the whole series of lectures was the actuality of. And I said, well, I give a paper on Marx, and my first thesis is, people think that the crisis of the euro and the worldwide economics shows that Marx's actuality is there, and that's wrong. The actuality of Marx is not in the theory of crisis, because we have better theories of crisis on the one hand, and this part of Marx's theory is a very complicated thing, because it's not the latest thinking of him and has never been fully worked out. And my reading, the most interesting thing in Marx is his anthropology, and are such notions as alienation, recognition, and reification. These are critical concepts we can use in a broadly social, political, and ethical philosophy, not the directly economic analysis. Because I think there a lot is better worked out in very different approaches in economical theories than in Marx's one. But one of the reasons is I never studied Marx as an economist, and Capital for me is a philosophical book, and not a starting book in economical theory. All this is highly contested. But I think if we get Marx back, it will be because he is an interesting author in terms of biotechnologies, talking about the human bodiness, of being able to suffer, and neediness and so on. These are anthropological things combined with an historical approach he got from Hegel, because the traditional philosophical anthropology we had in Germany was ahistorical. And Marx, as Hegel, combined a social, a critical, a historical, and an anthropological approach to the human existence. I think this is very interesting if we think about technological changes and improvements in biotechnology, when we change human nature. This is what I think is really impressive to look there, and nobody's doing it until now. Bioethics is not interested in Marx, and that's a mistake, I think.
Thank you. Now a more general question. Our blog hosted some contributions along the lines of a controversy that originated from some declaration of Australian Minister Jenny Briggs. He declared some research topics in philosophy ridiculous and not worth to be given public money. The majority of the mentioned projects were actually concerning Hegel and German idealism. We wonder what is by you the value that philosophical studies should have to the eyes of external observers, and also if you think that the renewed attention to German idealism might suggest a revised importance of philosophy and humanities in the educational framework.
To say it bluntly, this quote, I was in Australia when this was in the newspapers, and I was discussing this with Paul Reddick directly, who was the one being under attack. And I simply said, now you know that there are idiots in your political scene. That's all to be said about that. We have to fight against it politically, but we cannot do anything in terms of philosophy with it. No politician would say, I don't understand relative complicated physics or the basics of medicine, because I don't understand that, it's rubbish. But here in philosophy and other things, they think because it's too complicated to understand it directly, and we all know that it's complicated, it's not worth it. But this is only a prejudice, and it's what I call scientism. They think some things are directly relevant to make money, and this is all about money. Yeah? And this is why I say read Marx. If you think all it's about money, you are destroying our world, and we have to attack it. Yeah? But not by persuading such guys, but persuading young people to say there's something important going on. Fight for that. Don't vote for these idiots. That's all I can say about it. No pasaran, I would say. They won't make it.
So, in Italy, a debate on realism was recently opened, where to realist faction a postmodern one is opposed. In this context, perhaps rather more for journalists than for actual philosophers, German idealism is usually identified as a precursor of the postmodern, having stressed the importance of history in its systematic construction. Would you agree with such an interpretation?
No. German idealism is a broad label for a very complicated group of philosophers having written very complicated books. But there is one way to historicism, from a special reading in Marx and Hegel in the 20th century in Germany, like people like Gadamer and so on. They lost belief in metaphysical thinking, and if you eliminate the metaphysical structure from Hegel and Marx, then you get historicism or storytelling or something like that. But it's not in Hegel and in Marx. There is a kind of very structural, very deep, foundational, even universalistic approach to philosophy. They thought that history is part of the universal structure, and not that universal structures are only part of history. That's a mistake. And postmodernism was under attack by Fichte and by Hegel. The postmodernists of their times were the Romantics, and they fiercely attacked them. Sometimes they were not fair, because not all of the Romantics were that bad, but they always said we have to stick to the notion of philosophical universal justification of arguments. And I think postmodernism gave that away. They didn't want to give stronger epistemic or rational structures of justification. They all put it into context and put it into culture, and they lose what to put into that context by doing it. That's a mistake, and one of the sharpest and best critiques of such a mistake you find in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. So it simply is a misunderstanding. And on the other hand, nobody who's starting such a discussion using the contemporary anti-realist realist conceptions knows that at least Schelling and Hegel try to overcome that distinction. They are speaking about the subject-object structure or the ideal realism. They thought that subjectivity versus objectivity or idealism versus realism is the wrong opposite. You have to overcome it. And one another source of the mistakes is that the word idealism in German, idealism, is not identical to anti-realism, because there is some complicated philosophical shift of meaning here. So this is, I'm saying it, not very clever philosophy to put it these ways. As I always tell my students, if you put philosophy in such slogans, you are pretty sure that you are wrong. It's more complicated if you have a look at it. Right?
So in conclusion, me and Alessandro have a combined question for you.
Okay.
We wanted to ask you some reading advice. I was wondering what is to you the book by Hegel, if there could be only one, from which to start to build an interpretation of Hegel up to present matters and concern.
And also, what book or essay would you instead indicate to those who want to approach Hegel for the first time, so that they should become passionate to his philosophy?
Yeah, very complicated question. So, my first advice really to all the students is read Hegel and not someone writing about Hegel. Go to the sources, back to the sources. This is important, even if it's very, very complicated. If you ask which book as a whole book, I would always say The Philosophy of Right, due to many reasons. A lot of people love this phenomenology of spirit, but I don't like that book very much. But there's one part of it, a very small 10 pages, so not the preface, which is cruel to read, but the introduction. There's a 10-page introduction in which Hegel gives a lot of hints what his method is. So if you want to have a small text, this would be helpful. But it takes half a year to read these 10 pages. That I always have to say, read very, very slowly. And a final tip, which is for upgraded students, I would say, is there is a kind, in German it's called Vorbegriff. If you have this encyclopedia, there are 30 pages Vorbegriff as part of the introduction of the logic. In that, Hegel tries to tell the reader what the difference of his metaphysical approach towards others is. And this is one of the best texts he has ever written. So these are parts you can really get into him. And best is read it together and discuss it, and read sentence by sentence very, very slowly, and never try to find an answer in the literature on Hegel. Try to find it in the text yourself. Literature is always putting it astray and telling their own stories. So I'm producing some of these texts, so I would say you can do it if you are starting to be a Hegel researcher, spell it out and write it, but if you want to start understanding Hegel, read him and not something in a broadly Hegelian sense. That doesn't help.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.